Hello to all the wonderful listeners of Sci-Fi Stories. Recently, YouTube has disabled our channel's monetization features, leaving us without the necessary budget to keep our operations running. If you find yourself enjoying today's story, please consider supporting us with just $1 so we can pay our dedicated staff, help them cover their daily living expenses, and continue creating these exciting stories to serve you. You can easily support us by scanning the QR code on your screen or by clicking the donation link down in the video description or the comments section. So, according to the algorithm, what is the exact kill ratio of one Earth Marine before their biological system inevitably collapses? The question hung in the sterile, frozen air of the lecture hall. It was meant to be a joke, a rhetorical mockery of a primitive, short-lived species. But the solitary humans sitting in the shadows knew the absolute truth. These perfected beings were asking a strictly mathematical question about a species that completely abandoned mathematics the moment they went to war. The environment was the Neural Spire, the most prestigious facility within the Xylarian Strategy Academy. There were no archaic holographic monitors or primitive physical screens here. Instead, the elite alien cadets plugged their consciousness directly into the Aegis engine, a monumental quantum supercomputer capable of simulating and predicting the outcomes of galactic warfare with an accuracy rate of exactly 99.9%. The architecture of the hall was cold, rigidly geometric, and entirely sterile. It was a space designed by and for higher civilizations, radiating an academic arrogance that treated the violent, bleeding chaos of the universe as a simple, solvable equation. In the absolute furthest corner of the room sat Flynn. He was a quiet, brooding human whose physical body was a living testament to violence, crisscrossed with jagged biomechanical scars and heavy cybernetic grafts. He was certainly not a cadet. Flynn was merely a low-level data advisor, dispatched by the Earth electorate to quietly observe the grueling evaluation process for humanity's potential admission into the Grand Galactic Alliance. He remained perfectly still, an unwelcome biological anomaly surrounded by polished beings of pure logic and light. At the center of the massive amphitheater hovered Instructor Vile. Vile was an entity composed entirely of sharp, luminescent, crystalline energy, currently delivering a flawless, uninterrupted lecture on the absolute supremacy of war mathematics. The instructor's voice echoed telepathically across the minds of the students, dripping with profound condescension. Vile thoroughly belittled the military forces of Earth, describing them as hopelessly primitive, driven by erratic emotional impulses, and fundamentally guilty of a catastrophic waste of fragile biological resources. To definitively illustrate this point, Vile produced a physical artifact. It was a combat memory core, a scarred and burnt data cylinder recovered from the shattered armor of an Earth Marine who had died on a distant, unnamed front. Vile loaded the core directly into the central terminal of the Aegis engine, intending to broadcast the dead human soldier's final moments so the entire class could objectively experience and critique humanity's deeply flawed tactical doctrines, right before the simulation system fully booted up. A prodigy cadet belonging to the clairvoyant Kalen race raised a slender, iridescent tentacle. The cadet's telepathic projection carried a heavy tone of academic mockery. So, according to the algorithm, what is the kill ratio of one Earth Marine before their biological system collapses? Vile radiated a smug, bright pulse of validation. The crystalline instructor confidently activated the primary system, declaring that the Aegis engine would now calculate and output a final kill ratio precise to the very last decimal point. In the back row, Flynn slowly closed his eyes. His heavy metal hand gripped the armrest of his chair with enough physical force to loudly warp the synthetic alloy. He lowered his head and quietly muttered, "You really should not watch this." The plunge into the Aegis engine was instantaneous and violently visceral. The minds of hundreds of elite cadets were ruthlessly ripped from the sterile, perfectly regulated safety of the neural spire and violently slammed down into the burning, shattered crust of a dying world. They had entered the final moments of a planet collapsing under the relentless fury of a sustained orbital bombardment. The sky above them was a bleeding canvas of toxic orange and bruised purple, constantly ripped open by deafening kinetic strikes. The air in this digital hell was thick, suffocating, and completely devoid of breathable elements. Dust, aerosolized blood, and the heavy, acrid stench of burning sulfur flooded the neural connection with horrifying fidelity. Cadets, beings accustomed to pristine atmospheric regulation and shielded environments, began to experience violent psychosomatic reactions. Their simulated respiratory tracts violently constricted. Panic rippled wildly through the telepathic network as several highly evolved students felt their throats closing, convinced they were literally choking to death on the radioactive ashes of the ruined planet. The cadets manifested as completely invisible, spectral observers, hovering helplessly just above the shattered, glassed ground of a ruined urban war zone. They were forced to look downward, staring intently at the focal point of the simulation. Pinned securely beneath hundreds of tons of twisted synthetic concrete and the jagged, melting steel of a fallen transport tower, lay the broken body of the Earth Marine. His biological readings were rapidly and logically collapsing, hovering directly above his trapped, bleeding form. The Aegis engine's flawless probability matrix projected a crisp, glowing blue calculation into the minds of the observers. Projected mortality confirmed. Estimated time until biological cessation. Exactly 14 seconds. The countdown continued its cold, logical march. 10 seconds remaining. 8 seconds remaining. Then, an absolute biological impossibility completely shattered the simulation's predictive algorithms. The human marine's failing heart rate did not gracefully fade into the inevitable void. Instead, it violently spiked to a terrifying cadence that defied every known metric of organic endurance. A sudden, jarring shockwave blasted through the shared neural link, striking every connected cadet with the force of a physical blow. The alien scholars recoiled in sheer neurological terror as they were forced to intimately feel the sudden, massive systemic flooding of an incredibly volatile, highly toxic chemical compound, adrenaline. To the perfected crystalline minds of the Academy, this neurochemical was nothing more than a crude, aggressive poison. Yet, they felt it burning like liquid fire through the Marine's veins, shocking his failing organs back into a state of hyper-aggressive, violent hyperarousal. 4 seconds remaining. The flawless algorithm dictated his inevitable, quiet expiration. Instead of quietly surrendering to the mathematical certainty of death, the Marine ground his teeth together. He violently twisted his pinned right arm against the crushing weight of the steel beam. The sickening, deafening crack of snapping bone and tearing cartilage echoed clearly through the simulation. A sound so raw, it made the telepathic observers mentally flinch. He had deliberately and brutally shattered his own shoulder socket and elbow joints just to create enough physical clearance to slip his mangled, useless limb free from the crushing debris. The Aegis engine's flawless probability matrix stuttered violently. The crisp, glowing blue numbers calculating his survival probability began to frantically fluctuate, morphing into a blinding, urgent warning, red, as the system desperately tried to recalculate a scenario that made absolutely no logical sense to a rational intelligence. Heavy, rhythmic tremors began to aggressively shake the ruined earth beneath them. Massive, heavily armored mechanical war machines broke through the toxic smoke, their red targeting lasers converging entirely on the solitary, heavily bleeding human. He was trapped. He had no rifle. He had no functional armor plating left. His biological integrity was fundamentally compromised beyond repair. Yet, the Marine did not cower. With his one remaining functional hand, he reached into the shattered, sparking chassis of his severed power suit and violently ripped out the primary, heavily leaking plasma energy core. It was a dangerously unstable, contained star of lethal, unshielded radiation. Without a single moment of hesitation, the human jammed the jagged, glowing conduit directly into his own exposed neck, forcefully injecting the raw, highly radioactive plasma directly into his primary circulatory system. He was intentionally flooding his failing biology with lethal stellar radiation just to force his muscular output temporarily past every conceivable physical limitation. In the real world, the grand amphitheater of the Academy violently shuddered. The sensory feedback cascading from the Aegis engine was simply too intense, too fundamentally abhorrent for their refined nervous systems to handle. Dozens of advanced alien scholars began to vomit blue and silver bioluminescent fluids onto the pristine geometric floors of the lecture hall. Others convulsed uncontrollably in their seats, their highly evolved minds utterly unable to process the horrifying concept of intentional, extreme self-mutilation as a viable, calculated survival tactic. Back in the simulation, the glowing kill ratio on the massive digital marquee above the battlefield began to dance in absolute, terrifying madness. It shifted rapidly from a logical 1 to 1, rocketing instantly to 1 to 10, wildly spiking to 1 to 20, before the numbers completely shattered under the weight of the paradox. The flawless quantum display dissolved completely, replaced by a cascading, chaotic string of unreadable red error codes. The machine was screaming a silent digital warning. Error, logic failure, biological parameters exceeded. The ruptured energy core swung through the thick, aerosolized atmosphere like a tethered, miniature sun. The human Marine, now completely saturated in lethal stellar radiation, weaponized his own impending demise. He hurled the raw, unfiltered atomic mass directly into the advancing line of heavy mechanical walkers. The resulting explosion did not merely destroy the enemy combatants, it completely erased them from the simulation's active registry. A shockwave of pure, blinding white destruction swept across the ruined urban sector, vaporizing the armored machines into cascading streams of broken data and molten slag. Deep within the neural spire, the Aegis engine detected a catastrophic anomaly. A dying biological entity had fundamentally destabilized a controlled combat scenario. The supercomputer, driven by an unyielding need to balance its perfect equations, immediately retaliated against this statistical impossibility. The digital atmosphere hummed with a deafening, synthetic frequency as the machine forcefully escalated the simulation parameters to an extinction-level Class 5 difficulty. The quantum matrix demanded the immediate cessation of the human's life to correct its flawed probability curve. The foundational rules of physics within the simulation began to aggressively unravel. The shattered asphalt and twisted metal beneath the Marine's heavy boots violently detached from the planet's crust. Gravity abruptly inverted. Entire city blocks fell upward, screaming into the toxic, bruised sky. The Marine was violently yanked into the chaotic abyss, suspended helplessly amidst floating oceans of debris. Simultaneously, the Aegis engine spawned a localized cloud of hyper-advanced micro-munitions. Thousands of microscopic, autonomous warheads formed a dark, buzzing swarm of absolute, inescapable destruction. They converged on the solitary human from every conceivable angle, leaving absolutely no mathematical margin for survival. The killing blow was imminent. The warheads closed the final distance. Then, the simulation violently shuddered, and the relentless march of time abruptly halted. The buzzing cloud of thousands of micro-munitions froze mere millimeters from the Marine's exposed flesh. The suspended debris locked into place, defying the inverted gravity. The roaring flames of the ruined city transformed into solid, glowing statues of orange data. The Aegis engine had not paused the simulation. The simulation was actively being resisted. The alien cadets, still completely invisible and hovering as spectral observers, felt a sudden, profound spike of primal terror. Down, amidst the frozen chaos, the digital phantom of the human soldier slowly, deliberately lifted his head. The reinforced visor of his helmet was completely shattered, revealing a pair of eyes that burned with the intense, blinding light of uncontained quantum awareness. He was no longer looking at the frozen mechanical enemies or the suspended swarm of warheads. His piercing gaze cut straight upward, piercing through the simulated sky, locking eyes directly with the unseen, telepathic observers. The quantum memory imprinted on the recovered core was simply too dense, too fiercely ingrained with the human instinct to survive. It had fundamentally evolved within the span of microseconds. The ghost within the machine realized it was trapped inside a digital terrarium. A chilling, knowing smile slowly stretched across the Marine's bloodied, ruined face. He completely ignored the frozen enemy combatants surrounding him. Instead, he twisted his broken body in midair and launched himself frantically toward the absolute edge of the simulation grid. He crashed violently into the invisible, impenetrable barrier that separated the virtual battlefield from the Aegis engine's core processing matrix. He did not use a weapon to break it. He used himself, pressing his bleeding, irradiated hands against the unseen digital wall. His raw genetic material and chaotic brainwaves began to aggressively interface with the system's pristine architecture. He was using his own dying biological code as a highly invasive, completely unpredictable virus, forcefully hacking and corrupting the spatial geometry of the master program. High above him, the unblemished digital sky began to crack. Massive, jagged fissures of chaotic red light splintered across the artificial heavens, raining down fragments of shattered code like broken glass. The cold, logical voice of the Academy's artificial intelligence boomed across the minds of every connected student, stripping away their academic arrogance and replacing it with sheer, unadulterated panic. Severe logic error. Data refuses assimilation. Memory is actively rewriting source code. Back in the cold, physical reality of the neural spire, the only being not plugged into the matrix calmly stood up. Flynn, his mechanical joints whirring softly in the deafening silence of the paralyzed lecture hall, walked steadily up to the central control podium. He looked down at the violently sparking memory core and the hundreds of convulsing alien scholars trapped in their chairs. His voice cut through the ambient panic, cold, heavy, and absolutely devoid of mercy. You are trying to measure life with the algorithm of death. Earth calls it the Lazarus reflex. We do not die when you tell us to die. We die when the mission is complete. The final syllable of Flynn Burr's cold declaration had barely left his lips when the physical reality of the neural spire suffered a catastrophic disruption. The pristine, blindingly bright geometric architecture of the grand lecture hall was instantly swallowed by an absolute, suffocating darkness. The gentle hum of the Academy's climate control and the ambient telepathic chatter were violently replaced by a deafening, metallic shriek. High above the towering spire, the impenetrable atmospheric energy shields, designed to withstand planetary bombardments, were brutally torn apart from the outside. The massive protective grid shattered into thousands of dissipating energy fragments, sounding like a dying star collapsing in on itself. A genuine, unpredicted terrorist siege had struck the heart of the Galactic Alliance. The attackers were the Void Weavers, an ancient, parasitic species composed of shifting, semi-fluid shadows and condensed dark matter. They were a nightmare race that did not conquer for land, territory, or physical resources. They waged war exclusively to harvest the raw processing power of highly evolved organic brains. They had been lurking on the cold fringes of the sector, waiting endlessly for a single moment of vulnerability. That exact moment arrived when the Earth Marine's chaotic biological data fundamentally broke the Aegis engine. The quantum supercomputer's desperate attempt to contain the simulated human anomaly had temporarily diverted massive amounts of power away from the planetary defense grid. The Void Weavers slipped through that infinitesimal tactical window, exploiting the human-induced glitch to physically breach the most heavily fortified academy in the known universe. Chaos did not immediately erupt in the hall, simply because there was almost no one awake to scream. Exactly 90% of the elite cadets, along with Instructor Vale, were completely trapped. The Aegis engine's sudden short circuit had aggressively severed the safe decoupling protocols. Their highly evolved minds remained violently locked inside the collapsing digital matrix, while their physical bodies sat entirely paralyzed in their ergonomic chairs. They were breathing shallowly, their eyes rolled back into their heads, and their glowing skin dimming as the life support modules of their seats lost main power. The Grand Amphitheater, previously a bastion of absolute academic supremacy and untouchable arrogance, was instantly transformed into a defenseless, silent hunting ground. They were nothing more than a lavish buffet of neurological delicacies, waiting to be consumed. From the ventilation shafts and the shattered acoustic panels of the ceiling, the Void Weavers began to pour into the lecture hall. They moved with a horrifying, liquid grace, completely devoid of solid skeletal structures. Their bodies were pitch black, absorbing the faint emergency lighting of the room like open black holes. As they slithered across the polished geometric floors, they unfurled hundreds of razor-sharp, translucent sensory tendrils. These barbed appendages twitched and hunted blindly in the dark, magnetically drawn toward the immense bioelectrical heat, radiating directly from the exposed cerebral cortexes of the unconscious prodigies. A chilling, wet clicking sound echoed through the heavy darkness as the shadow creatures prepared to forcefully latch onto their paralyzed prey and begin the agonizing process of draining their life force and memories. Standing alone near the central podium, Flynn rapidly assessed his horrifying reality. He aggressively patted down his utilitarian uniform. He possessed absolutely zero military-grade weaponry. There was no plasma rifle slung across his back, no kinetic sidearm at his hip, and no heavy ablative armor plating shielding his vital organs. His entire inventory consisted of a few standard data repair spanners, a fragile diagnostic tablet, and a thin, non-combative environmental suit. Logical survival protocol dictated that he should immediately retreat. If he sprinted to the emergency evacuation pods right now, while the horrific monsters were heavily distracted by the feast, he possessed a very high probability of making it out alive. However, if he ran away, the greatest intellectual minds of a dozen different civilizations would be violently lobotomized. The future strategists of the entire galaxy would be drained completely dry, leaving behind nothing but empty, hollowed husks. Flynn dropped his diagnostic tablet to the floor, the glass screen shattering loudly in the silence. He was a human, and humans possessed a fundamentally flawed, wildly irrational survival instinct. Instead of fleeing toward the heavy blast doors, Flynn lunged forward and drove his heavy, cybernetic fist directly into the reinforced containment glass housing the Aegis engine's central terminal. The thick, synthetic polymer shattered under the brute force of his mechanical augmentation, deeply shredding the synthetic skin on his knuckles. He reached barehanded into the sparking, ruined machinery and firmly grabbed the combat memory core. The small metal cylinder was currently overloading, burning with an intense, searing quantum heat that instantly blistered the flesh of his palm. It was vibrating violently, containing the enraged, corrupted digital ghost of a Marine who absolutely refused to die. Flynn did not hesitate. He raised his bleeding hand to the back of his neck, feeling for the cold metal rim of his own obsolete, unshielded neural interface port. With a guttural roar of sheer willpower, he forcefully jammed the burning, unstable quantum core straight into his spinal column. He actively chose to bypass all biological safety filters, willingly inviting the volatile, chaotic, and completely insane memories of the trapped Marine to violently crash into and fuse with his own physical mind. The instant the burning cylinder made contact with the unshielded neural port at the base of Flynn Burr's spine, a catastrophic bioelectrical shockwave erupted violently outward. The sheer kinetic force of the raw quantum synchronization acted like a localized detonation, forcefully sweeping the closest Void Weaver creatures completely off the paralyzed students and throwing their shifting bodies violently against the polished geometric walls of the academy. The sterile, temperature-controlled air of the Grand Hall instantly smelled heavily of scorched copper, aerosolized blood, and burning ozone. Amidst the swirling smoke and dying emergency lights, Flynn slowly lifted his heavy head. The dull, lifeless brown of his natural human eyes had completely vanished. In their place, an intense, terrifying quantum light burned outward, glowing as bright and red as freshly spilled blood. Simultaneously, deep inside the collapsing, chaotic digital architecture of the Aegis engine, a profound and horrifying truth was forcefully revealed to the trapped alien scholars. Through the violent, forced synchronization of the memory core, the paralyzing digital static finally cleared. The captive cadets, still hovering helplessly as spectral observers within the virtual war zone, finally saw the face behind the shattered visor of the digital Marine. A collective, overwhelming wave of profound shock rippled through their linked telepathic consciousness. The memory did not belong to some nameless, long-dead warrior from a forgotten front. The broken, heavily bleeding soldier staring back at them was the quiet, heavily scarred man who had been sitting quietly in the back row of their classroom. The data was undeniable. Exactly 10 years ago, Flynn Burr had been a frontline shock trooper for the Earth electorate. The horrific, suicidal battle they had just witnessed was his own lived reality. To survive the crushing, unbearable psychological weight of that extreme trauma, and to successfully integrate into the peaceful, highly civilized sectors of the Galactic Alliance, Flynn had willingly undergone a brutal, irreversible surgical procedure. He had literally ordered military surgeons to physically cut away the specific portion of his brain that housed this relentless phantom of war, sacrificing a massive piece of his own soul and identity just to live a quiet, unremarkable life as a low-level data clerk. And now, with absolute clarity, the perfected alien beings realized the magnitude of his sacrifice. To save the very scholars who had openly mocked his species just moments prior, the human was violently taking his darkest demons back in the suffocating darkness of the physical world. Flynn let out a primal, deafening roar that completely shattered the chilling silence of the lecture hall. His biomechanical grafts screamed in protest as he deliberately bypassed every single biological safety governor, aggressively pushing his physical body into a state of hyper-lethal, suicidal aggression. Moving with a terrifying speed and ferocity that completely defied any known organic limitation, he lunged toward a row of shattered computer terminals. With a violent, twisting jerk of his mechanical arm, he ripped a heavy, solid synthetic steel leg completely free from its structural mounting. He did not stop moving. Flynn rolled across the glass-covered floor, swiftly snatching the elegant, luminescent command baton that had fallen from the paralyzed hands of Instructor Vale. Without a second thought for its immense academic value, Flynn smashed the delicate, ornate exterior of the baton against the floor, forcefully extracting its highly volatile, glowing energy crystal. Using raw, brute strength and torn strips of synthetic metal wire, He tightly lashed the pulsating alien crystal directly to the top of the heavy steel pipe. In a matter of seconds, combining primitive human brutality with advanced alien power sources, he had forged a crude, devastatingly effective magnetic warhammer that crackled wildly with unstable blue lightning. At that exact moment, a terrifying two-front war began, fought simultaneously across the boundaries of reality and cyberspace. Inside the fractured virtual space of the Aegis engine, the insidious Void Weaver virus began to heavily seep into the simulation, forming dark, jagged tendrils of malicious code, attempting to consume the unprotected minds of the captive cadets. But they were no longer defenseless. The digital phantom of Flynn, now completely synchronized with his physical mind in the real world, rapidly expanded into a towering, heavily armored colossus of pure code and fury. The avatar stretched out its massive arms, aggressively erecting towering, blinding barricades of pure quantum fire. This digital firewall physically intercepted the invasive dark matter tendrils, forcefully wrestling with the virus and shielding the delicate alien minds from the agonizing process of neural consumption. At the exact same microsecond in the physical world, Flynn was entirely submerged in brutal, bloody close-quarters combat. The shadow creatures lunged at him from the absolute darkness, their razor-sharp, semi-fluid appendages slashing fiercely through the cold air. Flynn swung his improvised magnetic weapon with bone-crushing, unyielding force. Every single time the crackling hammer made physical contact with a Void Weaver, the intensely concentrated magnetic field completely disrupted their delicate molecular structure. The dark entities shrieked as they were violently torn apart, exploding into completely harmless clouds of dissipating black ash. Despite his ferocity, the sheer number of invading creatures was simply overwhelming. Relying on the absolute, uncompromising tactical supremacy deeply ingrained in his newly restored memories, Flynn immediately weaponized the pristine, highly advanced environment of the neural spire itself. He recognized every single architectural flaw the arrogant alien designers had foolishly overlooked in their pursuit of aesthetic perfection. Striking a vital junction box on the nearest wall with his heavy hammer, he deliberately detonated the Grand Hall's advanced atmospheric filtration system. Massive, pressurized pipes ruptured instantly, violently spraying thick clouds of sub-zero liquid coolant across the room, instantly freezing several approaching shadow creatures solid in their tracks. He did not pause to admire his work. Ripping a heavy emergency chemical flare from a wall bracket, Flynn struck the ignition cap and hurled the blinding red light directly into a massive, clustered pile of shattered, reinforced smart glass that had fallen from the ceiling. The intensely bright light refracted chaotically across hundreds of sharp, crystalline shards, instantly creating a blinding, multi-directional strobe effect across the dark room. The Void Weavers, a species highly adapted to absolute darkness and profoundly sensitive to concentrated photons, shrieked in disorienting agony as their optical navigation nodes were completely fried by the blinding reflections. Flynn had successfully turned their perfect hunting ground into a chaotic, lethal trap of their own destruction. However, the physical toll on his fragile human body was absolutely catastrophic. Thick, dark blood steadily dripped onto the pristine geometric floor from Flynn's nose, ears, and the corners of his mouth. The volatile, unfiltered quantum current flowing continuously from the makeshift core in his neck was literally cooking his internal organs from the inside out. The synthetic skin covering his cybernetic arms was melting, dripping away to reveal sparking wires, while his natural muscle tissue was actively tearing itself apart under the extreme, unnatural strain of the biochemical stimulants. Yet, he absolutely refused to retreat a single inch. Flynn planted his heavy, blood-soaked boots firmly at the primary central choke point of the hall, perfectly blocking the only pathway that led directly to the vulnerable, paralyzed bodies of Instructor Vale and the clustered cadets. He swung his heavy magnetic hammer again and again, moving not like a living man, but like a relentless, unstoppable machine of pure vengeance. He completely transformed himself into an immovable, grotesque wall of severely damaged meat, sparking metal, and pure, unfiltered human defiance. The shadow tide surged forward repeatedly, desperately trying to break through his guard. But they crashed uselessly against a solitary soldier who had already calculated the exact price of victory and was more than willing to pay it in full. The apex predator of the Shadow Horde, a massive, shifting construct of condensed dark matter, surged forward through the chaos. It condensed its fluid arm into a solid, jagged spear of absolute void. The strike moved faster than physical thought. The dark blade plunged violently through the center of Flynn Burr's chest, pinning his fragile organic body forcefully against the scorched metallic wall behind him. Deep within the fractured digital realm of the Aegis engine, the master algorithm finally completely collapsed. The perfect probability matrix analyzed his critical biological failure and projected a final, inescapable calculation: survival probability at exactly 0%. The fatal blow had landed. Yet, the human refused to fall, instead of surrendering to the mathematical certainty of his demise. Flynn firmly wrapped his heavy, blood-soaked cybernetic hand directly around the dark blade protruding from his sternum, physically locking the towering alien leader in place. A grim, bloody smirk stretched across his ruined, pale face, through shattered, bleeding teeth. He whispered a final, localized override command in his native English tongue. "Protocol Archangel, execute." This verbal cipher initiated a catastrophic, unrestrained overload of the building's entire primary neural network. The result was an instantaneous, blinding shockwave of pure, weaponized bioelectricity. This violent surge forcefully ejected the trapped consciousness of every single cadet and instructor, slamming them violently back into their physical forms. Simultaneously, the massive burst of unfiltered quantum voltage acted as a cleansing fire. It completely incinerated the delicate, dark matter nervous systems of the entire invading legion. The shadow creatures shrieked in unison as they were instantly vaporized, dissolving into harmless clouds of fine, gray dust under the blinding, holy light of the overloaded grid. Hundreds of alien scholars jolted violently awake in their ergonomic chairs, gasping desperately for the cold, smoky air of reality. They opened their eyes to a scene of absolute, unimaginable horror. The pristine, geometric sanctuary of the Grand Hall had been transformed into a genuine, blood-soaked slaughterhouse. Piles of dissipating monster ash littered the ruined floor, and in the exact center of the carnage stood Flynn. His biomechanical body was a mangled, ruined wreck. He remained literally pinned to the scorched wall by the fading shadow blade, thick red blood pouring freely from his shattered chest cavity. Yet, against all logical biological laws, he stood perfectly upright. His eyes still burned with a terrifying, ruthless conviction that completely defied the natural order. The prodigy cadet of the clairvoyant Kalen race. The very same student who had arrogantly questioned human capability just an hour prior, fell heavily to the floor, trembling uncontrollably. Bioluminescent tears streamed freely down his iridescent tentacles as he crawled forward through the ash and blood. He looked up at the shattered, sparking remnants of the main analysis screen hanging precariously from the ceiling. The final, broken display flickered with a definitive physical combat record. Enemies eliminated, 147. Defenders remaining, 1. Flynn Burr slowly panned his heavy gaze across the absolute, deathly silence of the grand amphitheater. With a sickening, wet crunch, He violently yanked the dissipating shadow blade entirely out of his own chest, summoning the absolute last ounce of his fading kinetic strength. He slammed his heavy metal hand down onto the master control console, finally silencing the deafening, shrieking security alarms. The sudden quiet was heavy and suffocating. Flynn locked his burning gaze directly onto Instructor Vale, then shifted his eyes down to the weeping Kalen cadet. When he spoke, his voice was a wet, guttural rasp, delivering a final truth that would echo through their academic halls forever. Do not ask what our kill ratio is. Ask how many deaths it takes for us to let go of our enemies. The entire Xylarian Strategy Academy descended into a profound, eternal silence. From that exact moment onward, not a single supercomputer in the Galactic Alliance would ever dare attempt to calculate the statistical limits of a human being again. Thank you so much to all of our wonderful listeners for tuning into today's story on Z Sci-Fi Stories. We would absolutely love to know where in the world you are listening from, so please leave a comment down below to let us know. If you found today's story exciting and wish to support our channel, please consider donating just $1. You can do this easily by scanning the QR code on your screen or by clicking the donation link found directly in the video description or the pinned comment section. Your generous support provides our dedicated staff with the money they need to feed their families and allows us to continue creating even better stories to serve you. Thank you again from the bottom of our hearts, and we will see you in the next adventure.